I'm Claude Nunes from Piscinas Ranch, and we want to talk a little bit about some of the design principles which we've been able to utilize, and we think really sort of improve some of the farming systems. That's me. I'm pretty cute. So, like I said, I kind of want to get right to it, but I would be remiss if I didn't sort of bring up the fact that there's a really fantastic scourge on the planet, and that is one of the great gateway drugs, which is cheese. Cheese was my gateway drug into the world of agriculture. I got a degree in music, which means I got a degree in food service. And through a really brilliant, fortunate, bizarre set of circumstances, I ended up as a cheese professional. I thought that was going to be sort of a placeholder job until I, got my big boy pants on and got a real career. But this is just way too much fun to be a career, right? How can you even take this seriously? But then I kind of had this really beautiful realization, which is that through the lens of fermented dairy foods, I could study just about anything I wanted. Economics, history, social studies, biochemistry, it was just all there. And that was super, super fascinating to me. So for me, what started off is trying to understand flavor in cheese. That led to understanding milk components. That led to wanting to learn more about ruminant diet. That led to wanting to learn more about plant physiology. And then ultimately led to me on a Wednesday morning with a breakfast burrito in hand to just typing in rangeland management on YouTube. And this became this fascinating wormhole that I just kind of tumbled down. It's amazing what you can learn on YouTube. I just want to let people know that. It is a pretty amazing resource. So after I started learning more about that, the word biocarbon sequestration came up, I would say 3 to 7 times every single day for me. It's fascinating. And in sort of concise terms, it's the idea that we can use plants and their natural ability to photosynthesize to take carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back where it came from, in the ground. Kind of a fancy term, but really, I'd say my life high came sort of 2 points. It was like BC, before biocarbon sequestration, and then after. So this is a huge thing for me. And that led me to meeting the love of my life, Miss Christine Jones. This is a lecture at Piscinas Ranch, and that's my head right there. I was the only person involved in retail dairy food at this lecture. It was pretty great. It was a 3-day soil workshop. We had farmers, ranchers, scientists, and the one lone cheesemonger. So that was really fun. Christine, I think, put into context something that is profound and basic, and I should have understood in 4th grade science class, and that is just the sheer beauty and immenseness that is photosynthesis. It's such a, photosynthesis, right? It's such a basic thing. We all kind of know it and understand it, but I get actually pretty emotional if I think about it too in-depthly for long enough. Just some weird factoids that I always have in my head. Photon of light that we almost can't even find the value of in terms of its mass travels 93 million miles in 8 minutes, and then it touches a green leaf, and then with atmospheric CO2 and water from its roots, it converts light energy into chemical energy in the form of sugars. And that's just like so bizarre and beautiful and strange. This is probably a diagram a lot of us are familiar with. Any sort of 4th grade science textbook would probably have this. The one thing that Christine Jones, I think, really put into context for me was the idea of root exudates. Turns out that, particularly with herbaceous plants like grasses and forbs, upwards of 40% of the photosynthetic work that plant has done gets exuded out its roots in the form of sugars to feed soil microbiology. It's something that a lot of people don't get, but it's, again, really freaking cool. These are mycorrhizal fungi that have attached themselves to a root on a perennial grass we found at our place. So mycorrhizal fungi, I like to call them the merchants of the soil. They are sort of the couriers and traders that are exchanging soil nutrition from those microbes to the plants in exchange for sugar. This is just the coolest thing in the world to me. I geek out. I hope you can understand my passion. So I, at that point, quit my job. I was going to go and learn about farming. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in the city anymore. But I walked away from that cheese shop with two really great lessons. The first one is the power of the value-added product. This is the cheese situation. If you're going to make and sell commodity milk, you need huge economies of scale to achieve any sort of level of profitability. In California, that's 1,500 to 2,000 cows in a lot of dairies in order for that to become economically viable. At the cheese shop, we worked with a dairy that was milking 8 cows and was profitable because they were making and selling cheese. And that's not just somebody in our backyard, that's somebody who's actually shipping cheese over 1,000 miles, but they have economic power because of the value-added product. The other really great lesson was something that my bosses talked about. They call it playground theory. And playground theory, concisely put, is the idea that if you make things fun, people are going to want to do it. So with this knowledge of, it's a religious thing. I became a photosynthetic fundamentalist, right? That is my religion. Taking that as my sort of driving force, thinking about playground theory, thinking about the idea of value-added products, it led me to this really cool question that I'm still mulling over, which is, do we think that we can make remediation of our farmlands, our croplands, rehabilitating ecosystems, can we make sustainability so fun that it pays for itself? And I think that we can. It's going to be a really long, hard kind of slog, and so before we begin on that, what we're going to need is a beer. Everybody needs a drink. And this is, there's been numerous anthropologists over the past couple hundred years who have written about alcohol as the primary driving force for the development of agriculture. Turns out that hunter-gatherers spend a lot less time finding food, doing the work that it takes to sustain them, than do agriculturalists. And so this has been a big question, like why did we abandon a world where we worked less? So yeah, this is one of the articles. I kind of like this idea. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think about it as I'm sort of harkening back to my ancestors 15,000 years ago who were making these decisions that have gotten us to now. I want alcohol to be the primary driving force for a new relationship between human beings and the planet. And I think that that's possible. I think that we can actually use that to pay for this change. But this is our baseline. This is a vineyard. This is typical, I would say, of well over 95% of vineyards in the developed world. Well, you can see what's happened here since the grape harvest. Vineyard crews come out here, they have pruned those vines, they've planted a cover crop, then they've tilled in every other row, and probably sprayed an herbicide. So we look at this and we see, I'm going to say somewhere in the order of 80% bare ground. Again, I'm a photosynthetic fundamentalist, right? Like this is deeply, deeply troubling. Go forward into a little bit later. So this is now in the growing season. The vines have still leafed out. We're capturing a lot more solar energy, converting that into sugars. But you still look at this, and that's easy, 70% bare ground. That is mostly bare ground. So all that notion of beauty and romance that I think a lot of people have when they see a vineyard, I don't have any of that. Right? This to me is a manicured desert. We have influenced the carbon cycle, we've influenced the water cycle. We think about this in terms of erosion. We think about this in terms of the microbial life that's in the soil. All those things have been held back by human management. And that's, to me, sort of a devastating reality. This is the beginnings of something really cool. So on the left is the control, and on the right is a new management system which my boss has been working on. These are the principles for soil health that the NRCS has devised. And we can look through this bottom section right here. Use plant diversity, manage soils by disturbing them less, keep plants growing as long as you can, and keep everything covered. What we see, what would you rather have? We have more diversity on that slide on the right. Cover is substantially greater. You're photosynthesizing a whole lot more than in this. I mean, that's, I think, one plant by comparison. So is there a tool that we think might be able to help us manage this? Can we increase cover? Can we increase profitability? one really cool thing on this, you can actually look at this. All of the sucker pruning that here would have had to been done by hand was done over there with no additional labor cost or fossil fuels. So this is our tool. This is an existing vineyard. You can see that there's a little electric offset that's been put up there so the sheep don't get their heads up and try to graze on the fruit. But all of that sucker pruning, all of that increased cover is really generated by these animals, their hooves, their mouths, their guts. And all of that plant mass is now being recycled as fertilizer, super rich, bioavailable fertilizer. So this gets us thinking a little bit. These are the farming principles at our ranch. I could spend an hour and a half talking about just this slide. I could probably spend more than that, but I'm really good at talking. What I think these have the backbone of those NRCS principles, those 4 principles for soil health. But in addition to that, we've incorporated the conversation about land, people, and money. So health of the plants, health of the land, those are incredibly important. Those have to be, I think, primary as agriculturalists. But including the conversation about ourselves and community and financial viability is sort of what these start to get into. And it leads us to this idea. So those concepts we have for our ranch have gotten us to the point where we're not even looking at how do we rehabilitate or tweak an old system, but how do we redesign that from the beginning. I like to think about this as opposed to a vineyard being a place that is dominated by vines, we want to have almost a grape savanna, right? What we have naturally on our place are big open grasslands. We're adding one more plant into that system and then managing with grazing even more richness and complexity and diversity in our native system. So it really turns the whole idea about what a vineyard is on its head. And this is happening both above and below ground. And this is what it's actually led us to. We've actually built this. It's pretty awesome. I got chills all the time going to work because you look at this and what was this concept on paper of open grassland, grape savanna is actually now happening. They're really cute little critters too. There they are. This is in the spring. Obviously, it's still pretty green and beautiful. Since this time, we've actually planted it, and those vines are growing. Come back and talk to me about 4 years, and maybe I'll get you a bottle of wine. Those concepts, though, are not only relegated to being in the vineyard. We have used those same concepts on our rangelands, on our croplands. This is irrigated cropland, which I call it rehabilitated. It's been tilled to kingdom come, and now through the use of, I think this is a 13-way cover crop, in both sheep and cows. In raising that, we're starting to build up a little bit more organic matter, starting to get the soil microbes turning. And how cute are those? Those are pretty cute too, right? This is sort of, again, the idea. This is, I think, really instructive in terms of our perspective on the vineyard. This is our vineyard before there are any vines in it. So we only planted the vines this past spring. That vineyard has been there in our minds, in our management strategy, in the way that we're doing our things for over 3 years. But that's our vineyard site, and that we've been managing and trying to keep that ecosystem moving in the direction towards complexity. We have some calculable dividends that have already been paid. We've doubled our organic matter in this site in 3 years. We started off with about 1.5%. We're now over 3%. Bits and pieces, but it's such a gratifying thing to think about this as much more complex and rich system than merely graceful. And another thing that I think is really significant, we had our first direct marketed lamb harvest. We killed 20 critters, sent them out to families, and we generated over $3,000 for local businesses, both in butcher fees and slaughter fees to local businessmen. That's awesome. We're feeding our community with nutrient-dense meat, and we're also feeding our community financially. And that's very, very important to the mission of the ranch. So, think that I speak for everybody on our ranch staff when I say that it's time for us to start thinking about the beer project. That's going to be the next chunk. Trying to get more carbon in the soil and more smiles on faces and try to get that stuff to pay for itself. I want to encourage everybody here to please drink the change you wish to see in the world and support the Booze Farm. Thank you.
I am not a ranch resident, but I'm working with the ranch, and Claudio just gave you a very good overview of what actually happens at the ranch. And I'm going to talk about what my work is of itself, and then why I am partnering with the ranch to further both their work and my work. So my name is Massey Burke. I live here in the East Bay, and I'm what I do that's actually become a joke over the years. People say, what do you do? But I call myself a natural materials specialist at this point. What I have been mostly is what's usually called a natural builder. Most of my work has grown out of the practice of bringing the use of natural materials into the built environment, physically and technically. And I started very grassroots, so if you know much about that world, as you probably do if you're here, there is a large and growing do-it-yourself movement for the use of natural materials in many different types of building, mostly in rural contexts, but increasingly in urban contexts, and that's one of my particular interests. I actually physically build things. This is a project on the East Coast. It's a rammed earth project. We built several walls as the centerpiece for a new public space near Philadelphia. The materials that you use to do this, so a quick overview of natural building. The idea, as much as possible, is to use the materials that your site gives you. And of course, again, when you're working in a rural context, that's a lot easier than an urban context. You know, you don't necessarily have the leeway to dig up your backyard to get clay soil in the urban context. But the basic materials that are considered common in natural building are clay soil, or soil with enough of a clay content to act structurally. Straw, which I'm going to talk more about later because it's one of the links to the overlap between my work and the ranch mission. Wood, stone, bamboo, you know, whatever you have available near you. I would say that dogmatic natural building focuses narrowly on only using site materials. Obviously, again, that's not always possible, but I think what's interesting about it is that when you refocus on primarily employing what you have in your immediate environment, then you're getting immediate feedback back about your impact. And so I think what is most important about natural building in our culture, or one of the reasons that it's a really useful skill to re-employ, is that it relinks us with biofeedback loops. You know, so how we're interacting with the living world and the direct impact that we're having. Because as we all know, our systems have gotten so complicated that evaluating your personal impact is actually quite difficult. And so I think I'm not dogmatic about using materials from site, though I really like it. But I think that's one of the best reasons to do it. So where do we get these techniques? Where does natural building come from? Well, it comes from cultures and practices where their only choice was to use local materials. And so the natural building movement has grown from interest around the world in relearning, preserving, and experimenting with traditional building techniques. So this is an image from Burkina Faso. This is maybe hands down, one of my favorites. And of course, natural building cultures vary immensely around the world because they are dependent upon climate and materials and culture and a lot of other things. These are the famous polished houses of Burkina Faso. And actually, I have not been here, unfortunately, but a friend of mine has, and they hand polish with clay and sometimes plant pigments, the patterns on their houses. And their villages are these crazy sort of interlocked. It's like the landscape just comes into the village and back out again, you know, and the village is just this enhanced piece of the landscape. Actually, that gets back to that question that Elaine and I were talking about. No, it's good. So we get these techniques from traditional cultures, but we also need to, so here's another great example of a log cabin in Moab. You know, so all they have are, you know, they have mud and they have twisted cottonwood trunks. You know, so this is the kind of woodworking you get from that. Are we going to build this in the East Bay? Probably not, but there are pieces of information that you can get from approaches like this that feed what we do now. So what do these buildings look like today if you're modernizing them? here's an example. This is actually where I live. This is a clay straw remodel of what was a very funky little stick frame structure in El Sobrante. And in this case, we did actually dig up the clay out of the backyard and use it. And this is a permitted remodel, so that's a side note that I'm not going to get into much for this presentation. But I do work on permitting issues for use of materials that are not in the building code, which natural materials. They are more now than they were, but they're not frequently not legal materials in that sense. So there are pathways to get permits. But yeah, so as a particular area of interest, what does it look like to legalize these practices? And that also links to acquiring technical information that we don't have. So, but I think what's interesting about natural building now is that I think people have there's a Hobbit house preconception of what natural building might look and feel like, and that's fine. I mean, I like hobbits as much as the next person, but they're not. That's not the only way natural building can manifest. And so looking at how natural materials, could complement a craftsman house, or could, we're experimenting with the expression of these materials in the culture. So slightly curvier. This is a cob and straw bale project with using mostly local wood, you can see. And this was a semi-art project, so the buildings are really curvy. The other end of the spectrum. So this is mostly conventional, but the floor is a resin floor. This is a remodel in San Anselmo. And this is something that hasn't been built yet. I'm looking for a site for it. It was designed for a community project in Lake County years ago. But it's a bamboo reinforced earthen pagoda. And so this is with an eye to pushing the envelope of what we can do with local bamboos. So the bamboo we can grow in the Bay Area, aside from the issues of bamboo being invasive and other things, the bamboo that we can grow is small diameter. So those can be brought together into composite columns with a clay matrix. And so I would like to see this built in the next year or two. This is one of my favorite techniques because it can be applied to any building pretty much. And so it's a good, when you're thinking about first an aesthetic that doesn't necessarily say Hobbit house, and second something that relates to a broad swath of the built environment. Earthen floors are a fun example in microcosm. I began as a builder, and that's been the focus of my practice for several years. But that has grown into what I call natural design, and then also structural research and carbon in buildings, which I'll talk more about. Natural design, so there are a lot of names for a lot of these things. You've probably heard the term biophilic design. So everybody knows about green design, so baseline, low impact materials, trying to improve building performance. But a lot of the green design world is moving beyond that into buildings that are regenerative, or they are explicitly linked to their site in various ways. And of course, we're all trying to come up with what we want to call this. So beyond green design, biophilic design is a real common title. I don't actually like that word very much, even though it's a great word. But for some reason, I feel it's a little bit abstract. I don't know. So I just call it natural design. So that and what natural design is and it's really design content that dealing with natural materials in an industrial context over the years has taught me. So it's really just taking what happens when you make a natural building and then expanding it out into what surrounds the building or the landscape, or the principles of natural building apply to existing buildings that you're not changing with physical techniques. So for me, natural design is employing information and pattern from the natural world to build or enhance human habitat. And it covers actually a quite wide range of practices, some of which I engage in and some of which I just try to set up for or encourage. And that's a lot of what my role is on the brand tangent, so I'll talk more about it. Structural research, just a quick note, I mentioned working with permitting, and we need more structural testing for certain natural building techniques for them to be permissible in code, and so I'm engaged in a structural testing program with a couple of nonprofits here in the Bay Area that work with these technologies. And then carbon in buildings. This is really interesting, and this ties back to, this is a very specific facet of natural design. So I think everyone is familiar with high performance buildings, buildings being insulated, not requiring a lot of energy to run them. Very recently, people have become focused on the embodied carbon in materials. And what's really fun about this for natural builders is that you cannot beat natural materials for their low carbon or possibly their ability to sequester carbon in the built environment. And so I've begun also a series of papers that touch upon this subject and just looking at the nuts and bolts of carbon when you're using straw in a building or when you're using bamboo in a building. Clay as well, though clay tends to mostly work as a fiber preservative, so it's a complementary material to allow biodegradable fiber to act as a carbon sink in the fabric of the building. So that's an overview of my work. So what am I doing at the ranch? So you got a great overview of what the ranch is up to from Claudio. And in the middle of this 8,000 acre, I would say, wonderland of experimentation. What would you call it? It's beyond that. I don't mean that to sound, at all. There's amazing work happening in the landscape of the ranch. Yeah, across the spectrum of rangeland, croplands, where humans live, and within that is the headquarters of the ranch. There's 11 acres of a spread of buildings from many different eras. That is not particularly integrated because it's just come into existence and responded to various owners and intentions over time. But it is also our most powerful communication tool at the ranch because it's where 90% of the humans go, is to ranch headquarters. So the ranch hosts weddings, there's workshops and various other reasons. And all those people come to this little piece of the ranch that's right in the middle and that probably is... And then there's some people that yeah, and of course there are the residents at ranch headquarters who live this every day, and so what we need to end when you get out into the landscape, and Claudia, you should interject here if you want. There are these amazing things happening in the croplands and the rangelands, but unless you know what you're looking for, they're not very easy to see. It's hard to know what you're looking at, and so I was invited into the ranch process to help figure out how to make ranch headquarters a better communication tool for the cutting edge work of the ranch that's mostly out in the field. It's mostly not happening, except for amazing conversations and a lot of drinking. It's mostly happening in the headquarters itself, right?
Go ahead.
And so what that means is that I need to try to find a way to communicate human relationships with rangelands and croplands, but in the area where the humans live. And so I'm doing that by using natural building. So very specifically taking, this is actually Elaine's house, taking the natural materials from the ranch and exploring how they can contribute to existing buildings to better connect the feel of the ranch buildings to the land that they inhabit. So that's one technique. Natural design. So this is where most of my focus is going right now, actually, is looking at the ranch, the headquarters landscape, and looking at natural pattern, looking at drawing from ecosystems that specifically surround the ranch, and how those might be interpreted, reinterpreted, incorporated into ranch headquarters design, both to make the ranch act technically more like a piece of the landscape, and also to make it feel more like a piece of the landscape. Because one thing we had agreed upon very early on in the design process is that we didn't just want a bunch of signs. I mean, yeah, you've got headquarters, and you can make all this verbal information that's like, oh, these are all the things going on, but I think we all know that's not necessarily, it's a very narrow way to reach people. And so what we really want is for people to enter the headquarters and feel like you're in somewhere different. You don't really know why, but then there are a few little signposts in very strategic places that indicate what's actually happening technically at the ranch, and the whole fabric of the headquarters backs that up, and you begin to see why, as you inhabit the space of the headquarters. So that's what's driving our design process, and I'm spending this year having conversations with everyone who relate to all the different parts of ranch headquarters to generate this design content. And carbon research. And this is probably what I'm most excited about because, as Claudio mentioned, alcohol is possibly a way to monetize soil building and carbon sequestration. Building is also similarly a mechanism to begin to build what I call the carbon, or I guess everybody calls the carbon economy, right? So how do you begin to reorient our human capital towards an economy that builds soil, sequesters carbon in the soil, sequesters carbon in buildings, helps us rethink what the built environment is for. And so I wrote one paper that was very narrowly focused on straw and carbon in the built environment, so how that can begin to act as a carbon sink. And now I'm really interested in using the ranch work in the field to talk about how, so this is an image of Mexican flat, which is one of the croplands, and it's producing many, many things as a part of regenerating the soil and offering grazing to both sheep and cattle. But one of the things it could produce, and I think will in the next seeding, is straw, which of course is what I build with. So you've created a landscape that is demonstrably going in the right direction. It's sequestering carbon in the soil. It's building the soil, rebuilding the soil structure. It's producing forage and meat and all these other things, and also producing buildings. So if I, as a builder, am buying that straw from this landscape, and also that straw then goes into the fabric of the building and becomes a carbon sink, then suddenly you've created this biofeedback loop that completely restructures that piece of the economy. And so the end of my year, this year at Pisces, is going to be writing a paper on that relationship. The relationship between carbon sequestering landscapes, carbon sequestering buildings. Yeah, and that's where we're headed, and that's the big, I would say anybody who's working in the built environment, has to address carbon. Obviously most people don't, but we have to, right? And there are many initiatives in California that are driving this forward very quickly. But my feeling is that this concept, the relationship between the habitat that humans make for ourselves, and what happens out in the rest of the biosphere, can be re-understood as a reciprocal relationship. And within my work, the most powerful way to do that at this time is through the lens of carbon, and how we're rebalancing that cycle on a global level. And also I feel that this is a good way to express what the ranch is about. It's about building complex systems above and below ground that are both human and wild in ways that work together beyond what I think we've imagined in our culture. Thank you.